Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is, I'm Peter Whittle. Now I'm delighted that my guest today is Konstantin Kisin. Hello, Konstantin.
Good to be back.
He's been on before, obviously, I'm sure, because there's a lot of crossover, I think, in the show that you watch here and also with Trigonometry, which he co-hosts with Francis Foster. It's a hugely successful channel, pleased to say. But also, of course, Konstantin is a comedian, increasingly a commentator, and also a forthcoming author, because his book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, will be coming out in a few months' time. Thanks very much for coming on.
Good to be back, Peter. Thanks for having me.
I went through your, introduction there. It seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, that the comedian part of that is slightly taking a back step. Is that right?
Yeah, the main reason is just family life. When lockdown happened, I suddenly realized I hadn't seen my wife for a couple of years. That's how hard I was working. And she was making that very clear. Yeah. And the days of me driving up and down the country to do drive for 3 hours to do a gig to, 100 people and then drive back home or whatever it was. I just don't have the time. With Trigonometry, we are doing a lot of satirical stuff now. And so the comedic instinct is still getting an outing. It's just not getting an outing in a stand-up format. I enjoyed it. And if you remember, you hosted me here with my show, All Of It Ends Well, and people enjoyed it.
Loved it.
I enjoyed my time as a comic. And if I could do it from my bedroom, I think I'd still be doing it. But it was just, the lifestyle isn't for anyone who wants to have a family life. And my wife, we're expecting our first child now.
Well, when's that going to happen?
Early to mid-May.
Oh, fantastic.
So, it wasn't going to work. And yes, and also, of course, with some events that have been going on recently, it's meant that I've leaned into more of the serious commentary. And I'll always have many strings to my bow, I suppose.
But, well, yes, I suppose you say it's a practical consideration, family. I don't wish to be too earnest, but is there also the sense in which things are so serious it actually takes away the desire to do it in you, or not? No.
I actually, in some ways, as someone of Russian descent with the Ukrainian family, Ukrainian wife, Ukrainian mom, I almost wish I was back on the comedy now, because it's a rich time and people want answers and people want humor and people want this very dark time to be lightened up a little bit. I'd be very happy to be doing comedy now. It's just it's the practical side of it. There's lots of jokes to be made always, particularly in dark times, in my opinion. And myself coming from a Russian Soviet background and from a Jewish background, that was always the way in the Soviet Union, Peter, particularly for Jewish people, is making light of the very difficult circumstances in which they were living. That's always been a big part of my attitude to comedy. So no, I'd be happily doing comedy if it wasn't for all the practical stuff right now.
But you've been doing a hell of, I've seen you a lot on the media, for obvious reasons, for the ones you've just described, given the current situation in Ukraine. You did Question Time. What was that like for you doing Question Time?
It was interesting because I think for both of us who are fairly strong critics of the mainstream media, I was pleasantly surprised by some things, I would say. It's clearly a program that's made by very bright people. Now, it's true to say that they're all anywheres in David Goodhart's definition. They're all sort of metropolitan, very open to the world, and few of them, I would say, felt to me like people who are attached to a specific place. And so some of the issues that you and I talk about on our shows might not be as open-minded, but I know that they watch Trigonometry, for example, to look for guests. Now, the slot they're filling with them is is a different question, but nonetheless, it's made by interesting, bright, intelligent people. So that was reassuring. And I was pleased to go on there, and I think to make some points that people maybe haven't heard before.
Yes.
Particularly in a way that I think was quite direct and honest and upfront about what was going on. So that was good. I enjoyed that. I think it's good. So whenever I'm a critic of the mainstream media, and I think they've done a very bad job. And many people wrote to me afterwards saying, that was the first time I've watched Question Time for 10 years or 5 years or 7 years or whatever it was. And I'm one of those people. I used to watch Question Time religiously. I was in the audience of Question Time probably 16 or 17 years ago. That's how much I used to love the program. I used to love the debate and the discussions that were being had. And I think it slid slid since.
Yeah.
So I was pleased to be there and to add perhaps a bit of what I think is necessary, which is straight talking, honesty, and cutting through all the nonsense that I think you get from politicians on there.
Yes, I remember doing it myself. It was, 2018, something like that, I think it was. And I remember being pretty nervous about it, actually. But it was the audience thing, because the bias thing is often seems to be supplied by the audience. People always going about the BBC handpicking people or not being balanced. But for some reason, my audience down in Plymouth were not bad. So once you're sitting there in front of them and you can see the whites of their eyes and everything, I suddenly sort of relaxed a little bit. But I think that the main thing has been that people have criticised it for being just very monolithic. I mean, everyone basically has the same view, but obviously, not in your
Yeah,
case.
I think on my program it was a bit different because it was about Ukraine and Russia, and that was a much more... It was a different issue to many of the divides we've been talking about for years now. But it's interesting you say you relaxed once you sat down, because I was relaxed all the way through. We drove down. I was very, very calm. I've done a lot of media, as you say, at this point, so it's not really anything new to me. We sat down on the desk, at the desk, very, very calm. And then when the program started, I remained very calm up here, but my body was absolutely frozen, and it took me quite a while to just take some deep breaths, and that was quite a surprise. But I think the magnitude of the number of people who are likely to be watching, I suppose, hits you at that moment.
It does, yes. And of course, presumably you got a lot of feedback on it.
Yeah, I had, feedback was very, very positive. And I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful that I was, as I say, I was able to go and put, I think, what was a fairly simple but a fairly straight set of points for people that they might not have heard before. And I think, a lot of people in the public responded. So that's rewarding.
I know that you mentioned your family, and I just wonder if I know you have talked about this before with other channels, but what is the kind of, you've got family you were born in Moscow,
yes.
So, but you've got family in Russia and in Ukraine, and your wife's Ukrainian, isn't she? So how much are you in contact with both sides?
Oh, all the time. Yeah, I speak to people in Russia, in Ukraine. I have family, and my wife has family in the north of Ukraine, and the south of Ukraine, and the west of Ukraine. It's a country to which I go, or used to go regularly, several times a year usually. So I'm very, very connected with that part of the world, which I think is why I have perhaps a slightly different perspective to many people now. Because I know what it's like on the ground. It's not something I've read about or watched a video about on YouTube.
And so you say you know what it's like on the ground, so there's not so much an element of surprise about what's been happening?
Well, I've been predicting this since 2014 in one way or another. Once Putin took Crimea and started a civil war in the two eastern regions, it was very, very clear to me that this wasn't going to stop, particularly given that there was no reason for him to stop. There was no pushback from the West of any material significance. So we allowed him to sort of complete this Anschluss with Crimea, and you go from there, really, don't you?
Yeah. What do you make of Zelensky? What I find can you explain this a bit? I mean, obviously we feel we've become very familiar with him, but I thought it would be interesting, given your background, how big was he on the Ukrainian cultural scene?
He was the biggest star on
the biggest.
Oh, the biggest. So people joked about it when he was first elected, because he hosted and he was the lead in a comedic series in which he played the president of Ukraine. And then he was then elected president of Ukraine. And it's interesting because I think his election was not universally well received, even though he got over 75% of the vote in what was at that point a completely free and fair election. So the majority of the people voted for him overwhelmingly. But it wasn't felt that electing a comedian president was necessarily, giving Ukraine international standing as a country that's to be taken seriously. There were many people who felt that this was, it was the best of all the bad options, but it did not bode well for Ukraine that it had to elect a comic president. But when I speak to people now, all of that sentiment has gone. He's universally seen as doing the right thing, as defending his country, as being courageous and brave. Now, it doesn't mean that everything he's doing, people agreed down to the last little detail, or that everything he was doing prior to the war people agreed with at all. There were many people, as there would be in any country, critical of him. But now, I think because it's wartime, there's very strong unified support behind him from many of his former critics too.
Are you surprised at the way he's handled it?
Yes.
You really would not have thought?
No.
Why?
Well, I don't think he'd had a chance to show his character, really. And so I think when we look back to something like Afghanistan, only a few months ago, where the moment the war starts, or the Taliban start pushing back because the Americans were withdrawn, the first thing the president does, pack all his money in a car and start heading for the border. That, in my mind, was a possibility. Now, that's probably very unfair on Zelensky of me to say that, but if you haven't seen him in this sort of situation before, how can you make that judgment? So I've been very surprised at the way that he's conducted himself, and all power to him.
Yes. I have to say, I think he's sort of given many people in the West a bit of a kick up the arse mentally. When you actually see someone, being so forthright and uncompromising, and then it makes you realize just how lily-livered our own leaders are, no? I mean,
I'd agree.
Would you think?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Of course.
I mean, it sounds like a typical question, but I just can't help but ask it. If comedians become highly respected leader in wartime, do you ever think, Konstantin, of becoming more political?
No.
Never?
God, no. God, no. God, no.
I'm not sort of saying, oh, you must have, but I just thought he was a comedian and a hugely successful. You, comedian, started the YouTube channel, but it is a political thing. I mean, and you are asked for more. I wonder whether it has ever occurred to you. Actually, I quite like the idea.
Yeah, no, I've thought about it. Not for a very long time, but very carefully nonetheless. And only in the sense that I think comedians, particularly comedians like me, who wanted to explore difficult subjects through comedy, in this country, in the Western world, where every tiny little thing that you said is going to be examined under a microscope, and people are not going to remember that you said something as a comedy piece. They're going to take it literally. You're going to get destroyed. And I get other comedians talking to me about, well, maybe I should run for this. And I always say to them, are you crazy? What are you doing? They're going to dig up that bit of material you did in 2012. And they're going to make it look like you meant it literally. You were not being sarcastic. You were not being ironic, and they're going to destroy your life. So no. But also, Peter, I think, let's be honest, I don't think that I would be able to maintain my forthright approach and speak honestly about the things that I think ought to be spoken honestly about if I were in politics. Politics is the art of trying to please people by not telling them the truth. I don't want to be doing that. And with trigonometry, we're having conversations that I think shape some of the discourse that is happening. And so if you wanted to have influence, I don't know that I'd have more influence as a backbench MP for wherever than I do now. If that was my ambition, whether that is my ambition, I'm very skeptical about. I'm not sure. The bigger our channel becomes and the more people listen to us, the more keen I am to become more of a bystander who just provides neutral commentary or factual commentary as opposed to getting involved.
Because it is, you're on over 300,000 subscribers now, aren't you? And I think you've got a point. I think that you probably do have more influence actually doing that than being a backbench MP. It's just a thought, because I suppose that there comes a time sometimes where you think, actually, I want to possibly, rather than being, as you put it, a kind of bystander commentator, I actually want to sort of like initiate something. But I think this is the problem, is that, as we're a little bit like discussing before we came on air here, is that you're then required to have an opinion of almost everything, and we don't, do we?
No. And by the way, the most important thing is not only do we not have an opinion, I would certainly say for me, I don't know about you, there is an almost immeasurable number of things about which I know nothing.
Yeah.
And so to have to then go into politics and suddenly have an opinion about, I don't know, internet infrastructure in Norwich, it's, what do I know about that? There's things that I think I understand, and I've tried to cover them on trigonometry in my interviews, in my book. in other things that I think are a valuable perspective as someone who comes from outside of the West and has perhaps an outsider's look, which was always my comedy. That's what it was based on around as well. And that's what I wanted to do. But I'm, I of course I have ego, but I also have enough humility to recognize that I don't know everything. And in fact, I know very little. So the little that I know, I try to share with people. Everything else is really for other people who have a broader perspective, perhaps.
The thing is that you said they're coming from outside the West. And as I said, your book coming out in July, which is already pre-orderable, I would add, is an immigrant's love letter to the West. But there's this odd thing, isn't there, that essentially, you're talking about coming from a country, the country of Dostoevsky, the country of Tchaikovsky, of, Shostakovich. It sort of is part of Western culture, isn't it? I mean, there is this schizophrenic. I've just been in Hungary. They talk often about this, that they would be classified as not being in the West. But actually, you're talking about the same things. We created the same things.
Well, I think to suggest that Hungary is not part of Western civilization is historically inaccurate. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was the center of Western civilization for a long time. I think the civilizational split, in my opinion, is, and Arnold Toynbee wrote about this in a study of history, is between Eastern Christian civilization, so the descendants of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Western Roman Empire, so the Western Christian civilization, which is one of the reasons that when, people like to make everything about race nowadays, of course, but when we talk about Australia and New Zealand and Canada, or particularly Australia and New Zealand, let's say, as being part of Western civilization, the reason is that these are the descendants of the people who were once part of the Western Roman Empire. That's why we call them the West, right? Even though they're geographically in a very different part of the world. So I think that split is there. So I think, of course, Russian writers and Russian musicians and composers and playwrights are a part of our cultural space. But it's a civilization with its own values, which frankly we're now seeing that difference in approach. You got to remember as well, Peter, of course, what we now call Russia spent a very long time under the Mongols, under the Mongol occupation, and many of the methods which were used in that time persist to this day in terms of people's mindset about how they should be governed and their approaches. So there is a difference between the two, I think. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't share and we shouldn't learn. I mean, some of the people that you've mentioned the Russian writers, for example, they're a huge part of our cultural sphere, and we would be very, very foolish not to learn from them. And that is, people now, as I'm critical of what's happening and what Russia is doing, there's some, ironically, Western people who've never been to Russia accuse me of hating Russia. I love Russia for precisely the reasons that you've just outlined.
Yes.
The people who've created some of the greatest literature, poetry, music, while being kept under the thumb precisely by the sort of people that are now invading Ukraine. That's the tragedy of Russia. It's people who are extremely bright, extremely intelligent, who think very deeply about the human condition, about philosophy, about literature, about art, who've been under the thumb of some very nasty people who've taken control of the country for centuries now.
Yes, because I'm glad to hear you say that. I remember I was just picking up one thing, and I think it was on Question Time, and you said, I feel very ashamed.
Yes.
Of Russia. Isn't it possible, though, to feel ashamed of the people running a country, but not the country?
Of course. And it's funny to me to be accused of not loving Russia, where I'm from. It's kind of like the trick that they tried to pull with Brexit, where people voted to leave and they were accused of hating Europeans as opposed to not wanting to be part of the European Union. Or people who talk about a sensible immigration policy being accused of hating immigrants. Of course it is. But when your country invades another and is killing innocent people and under completely false pretenses, then I think you are right to be ashamed of what it's doing. And I am ashamed of my country and what it's doing right now.
Ukraine is putting up, famously, an extraordinary fight. I mean, this is pure speculation, but are you in any way optimistic?
I can't see that far into the future. At this point, I think it's hanging in the balance. I've commented in recent weeks that my concern, and I'm not saying this is what will happen, but it is my concern, that the outcome of the conflict will likely be a Russian victory. Just the way things were looking at that time, it seems that the Russian advance has stalled completely now as we speak today. And in fact, Ukrainians are pushing back. My worry is nonetheless that all that will happen, Putin is desperate now. He's desperate to win. That they're just going to flatten more cities and they're going to start using worse and worse weapons. And essentially they will try to win at any cost, even if that means massive civilian casualties. Even if that means, this idea that the Russian government is putting forward is that they're rebuilding the Russian world as they flatten ancient Russian cities like Chernigov. It's atrocious. And so my concern is that Ukrainians are fighting very bravely. And if I were a Ukrainian on the ground in Ukraine, I would be right there with them fighting to defend my country. Yeah. And I hope to be wrong very much about this. I just worry that even as the conflict runs on, unless the West really steps up the level of help, particularly anti-aircraft support, because that's really what the Ukrainians need. They need to, as they say, close the sky to prevent Russian bombing and airstrikes. If they can do that, I think they might have a very good chance of winning. But if that doesn't happen, then you might just see that the conflict is extended. The outcome is unchanged, but the number of casualties on both sides, but obviously with the Ukrainian civilians particularly, goes up. So that's my worry. And it's a very difficult conversation. But as I say, I think Ukrainians, as you say, rather, I think Ukrainians are putting up a brave fight. And of course, I hope that they're successful.
Well, I think they've sort of been an inspiration, actually. What I find interesting, I wonder what your thought is on this, Konstantin. Obviously, you were pretty forthright during the pandemic, for example. We've had the pandemic. We had Brexit before that. You were a Remainer, were you not? Or you
I voted. I reject the label of Remainer, Peter, very harshly.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
But I did vote Remain.
You did vote, okay. Right,
Yeah.
okay.
To me,
I didn't mean with all the baggage.
I'm not having a go at you. I'm just I want to clarify the point. I think you can vote Leave and not be a Brexiteer, and you can vote Remain and not be a Remainer.
Oh, sure.
And that's I voted Remain, but once the vote came in,
yes,
I thought it was essential that we respect the democratic wishes of the British people.
Right.
And I think what a lot of people associate with the term Remainer is someone who voted Remain and thought that the vote of the other people was irrelevant, because that's what I voted for. I was never one of those people. No. And as you know, I was very open to hearing from people who had a different point of view to me. That's why I pick you up on it.
Okay, no, fair point. I suppose what the point I was going to make really is that, okay, let's take Brexit, leave it here.
Yeah.
And let's take the sort of pandemic. You wrote a great piece, actually it became a piece in Substack, where you now have a column, don't you? Which was a thread on Twitter about why people might be hesitant to take the vaccine. You weren't saying that they shouldn't, you were just saying why they might be. What I was wondering is, do you get impatient with people now who, on social media particularly, seem to see a kind of conspiracy in the situation in the Ukraine? And I've tried to sort of understand it, and I think that people feel that, for example, when it comes to the pandemic, that they were told lots of lies, or it was unreasonable. So they're actually now applying the same thing. They just simply do not believe anything.
Yes.
I mean, what's your attitude?
Yeah, well, I think we've got to delineate a couple of things within that, if you allow me to.
Yeah.
So, there's obviously, I think mainly these conspiracy stuff that, as you describe it, or a feeling that we're not quite being told the truth. Let's call it that, because conspiracy triggers people. So we won't use that word. It breaks down into two separate things. Part of it is the sort of populist left, and these are people who hate the West. Let's just call it what it is. They always hated the West. They see the West as the root of all evil, and so they will always side with our enemies. And I think we all know that. They're a small minority of the population. They've always existed. In times of peace, they bang on about other things, and I agree with them on a lot of the things that they bang on about, incidentally, normally. But in this case, I think they've shown their true colors, which I always thought would likely happen. I think on the populist right, it's a different set of things. So the left hate the West. I think on the populist right, there's a few things. The first one, of course, you mentioned, which is the media have been lying to us for a long time, and they know that. And so the skepticism about what the mainstream media is telling them is pretty natural. The other thing is that they don't like the Western elites, who they see as the ones that have been lying to them this whole time. And again, I have some sympathy with that. So that's another part of it. And the third one, I think, is as a result of those two things, they see Putin as someone who is challenging and attacking the people that they hate, Western elites. And so for that reason, I think it's tempting to sort of think that maybe, well, you know, maybe he's doing something necessary. I think that's how people are thinking. Another thing, of course, is if you are disillusioned with what your media are telling you, you will likely seek out other media that are giving you a different perspective. So a lot of people have been imbibing Russian propaganda uncritically. Now, I'm not a supporter of the shutdown of Russia Today, for example, that's happened recently. I think that was unnecessary. But I do think if you're going to watch Russia Today, which is pure Kremlin propaganda and always has been, one of the reasons I never did any interviews, I think, maybe I might have done one purely because, anyway, I try to stay away from it as much as I can because I didn't want to be involved in this. But if you're going to watch Russia Today, you have to use your critical faculties, and I think a lot of people haven't been. Now, am I frustrated by that? Well, initially, I was very frustrated by it. I've made my peace with it. I don't. People are allowed to think what they want to think. All I can do is tell them what's going on the ground in Russia, what people in Russian media are saying that they're not hearing, that what Russian leaders are saying that they're not hearing. That's one of the biggest problems, Peter, at the moment, is a lot of people don't speak Russian. They've never been to Russia. They don't understand. And so I've just been trying to put out clips about what's actually being said on Russian television, the way that Russian presenters, people who are equivalent to a Piers Morgan or an Andrew Neil, Kisilov and Solovyov, for example, are saying, and these people are openly talking about how Ukraine isn't the end of this, it's just the beginning. Yes. In order to secure the strategic interests of the Russian Federation, we've got to keep moving further. They keep threatening the West with nuclear weapons, etc. So, but if you only watch Russia Today, of course, you're not hearing that side of it. So, look, in 1938, if we had Twitter and YouTube, there'd be lots of people in those days saying, well, Adolf Hitler is perfectly legitimate in his view to free the Germans in the Sudetenland. And by the way, that was partly true, right? Hitler had more justification to invade Czechoslovakia than Vladimir Putin does to invade Ukraine, right? But does that mean we shouldn't have resisted Hitler?
Do you
see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so to me, the question of all these sort of different ways of looking at it is kind of irrelevant because at the end of the day, we're talking about a war of aggression in the heart of Europe. And that is all that matters to me. There's also a lot of nonsense about why Putin is doing this. People don't understand that he's been talking about this since the moment he came to power, that Kiev is the sacred place on the map for him, that he's always talked about pushing NATO back to its pre-1997 borders, which would mean all of Eastern Europe being under his control. They don't understand that when Russia talks about a neutral Ukraine, what they mean is going back to a time where Russia decided who the president of Ukraine was and how Ukrainians lived their lives. People buy into the propaganda uncritically. That's fine. People are allowed to think what they think. We live in a free country. But rather than focusing on them, I think, Peter, what we should focus on is the extraordinary support this country in particular is given to the Ukrainians.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because you said that you could foresee that this was going to happen, something like that. And I just wonder whether you could foresee or whether you've been surprised by the British response.
I have been very pleasantly so, Peter. Very pleasantly so. When I speak to people in Ukraine, and it's interesting seeing our media trying. They're still stuck in that frame of mind where like Boris Johnson is evil. And I am no fan of Boris Johnson, as I think I've made pretty clear on many occasions, particularly over lockdown and COVID. I think some of the things that he did in terms of the laws that he tried to push through, just despicable and completely un-British, in my opinion. And the way that we've seen his own personal hypocrisy on that issue has been, I've disagreed with many other things, and I'm deeply disillusioned with Boris Johnson and have been since pretty much the election, if you ask me. But at the same time, there is no question that of the Western leaders, Boris Johnson has been one of the very best in terms of addressing this issue, in terms of providing support to Ukraine. And if you speak to people in Ukraine, that is what they will tell you.
Yes.
Universally.
Yeah.
Universally, they say, thank you. Please tell people in Britain, when you speak to people, you guys have been the best. You've been sending support. You've been supporting us. And it means a lot. So there's no question in my mind that much of the West have abrogated, I think, their responsibilities, but Britain hasn't. And, you know, full credit to Boris Johnson for that. It pains me to say this, but he deserves credit. And so do many other people in the British space, in the commentary space and so on. I think we should give ourselves a pat on the back for how we've responded. And when I talk to ordinary people in this country, they've been raising money. I mean, on trigonometry.
You raised about 50 grand.
We raised 55 grand in an hour and a half, Peter. Wow. That's how strongly people all over the world feel about this issue. And so when British people are listening to this, who've been supporting the humanitarian effort or have been watching our government providing support to Ukraine, you should know that you should be very proud of your country in the way that it's stepped up in this moment, unlike many other Western countries. So I have no criticism to make on this particular issue of the British government at all. And on the British people, they've been extraordinary.
It's interesting, isn't it, how a huge crisis, or let's say just don't really begin to cover it, just calling it a crisis, something like this, sort of the scales fall from people's eyes in all sorts of ways. So I'm sure, for example, you know, like with Brexit, it took the debate to actually clarify what the EU was. And I think that a lot of people who didn't really pay much attention now know that Germany was taking all that energy from, you know, buying
Well, of
energy.
course, I've been banging on about this for years and no one was listening.
Yes.
But now we're starting to see that some of this... Now, I'll be honest with you. I mean, one of the things that has shocked me, one of the things I predicted very early on when Russia invaded Ukraine, was that I thought this was going to be, you know, a moment in which we would start to have a sensible policy on energy. And what I mean by that is, yes, of course, pollution and resource depletion and all of these things matter. And of course, we can have a conversation about climate change. But do we throw our security out of the window? Does Germany destroy its entire nuclear industry to keep little Greta happy? I mean, I didn't think all of this was particularly sensible. And I've been trying to make this point. We can focus on environmental issues that are important, Peter, without putting ourselves at risk of some much more immediate things that are a problem. And you see the weakness of Europe's response, continental Europe's response. Eastern Europeans, they're responding very strongly, and Poland's been brilliant, and other countries, because they know this nonsense about how Putin's just upset about NATO expansion. They know that's nonsense because they keep getting invaded by Russia over and over and over in their history. They know Russian expansionist ambitions have always been there and will always be there. But in Western Europe, let's be honest, they've sold themselves out, both in terms of their political elites to Russia and in terms of the energy infrastructure. They buy a tremendous amount of energy, and they don't want to inconvenience themselves by having to reorientate themselves to not doing business with this evil regime.
Despite, you know, what they do and how they have not stepped up in the right way, maybe, or strongly enough, you still love the West, don't you?
Of course.
So I suppose I'm being frivolous. You were talking obviously about Europe there, but your book, Love Letter to the West, I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but it seems to me that there is this kind of window at the moment. I think, you know, in a way your book is remarkably well timed. I know it wasn't intended like that, but that somehow or other we've got to get our act together. We sort of have, you know, kind of strategic way for this crisis, sort of. But I'm talking about the hinterland of that. All the things you've already talked about, kind of self-loathing, all of this. When you were writing the book, presumably, I mean, what started you off writing that? Was it what actually was it? Was there a sort of something that happened, or what? Why did you feel the need to write it?
I felt the need to write it, Peter, because I'm not saying I predicted that this invasion would happen on the 24th of February 2022, but my worldview is not the worldview that I think liberal elites in the West have been very keen to delude themselves into, which is we live in this peaceful, happy, pleasant world in which all we do is trade and get on with other people, and everyone elsewhere in the world, Peter, really wants that as well. All they want is peace and prosperity, and there's no one in anywhere else in any other part of the world who's in any way aggressive or authoritarian or expansionist, and all we just need to do is be peaceful and happy and friendly and make sure that we really respect the rights of everybody and blah 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 blah. I think the reason I started writing the book is it's the question I've been asking myself for a long time. What happens when a civilization that believes diversity is our strength encounters a civilization that believes strength is our strength? And
it has to grow up, presumably.
And it does have to grow up. And it has to recognize that diversity is only a strength to the extent that it is a strength. And all our other things that we've been focusing on are only a strength to the extent that they make us stronger. But if we over-obsess about certain things, then we detract from other things that matter, like making sure that we are confident in ourselves, that we bring up a generation of people who are critical of their country in a healthy way, who want to make it better, but don't grow up in a nihilistic, self-loathing, self-flagellating society, which tells them that everything that we've ever done is evil, that what defines us most here in the West is the evil elements of our past, the things that we were doing, which, by the way, they don't tell you were happening in exactly the same way, or much worse, in every other part of the world at the same time. So this myopia is what I've really been trying to speak about for a very long time, since before I wrote the book. But, I wrote a preface to the book in which I basically said that if we don't get our act together, our civilization is in danger. And I thought it was very powerfully written, and I showed it to a few friends, and they said, "Oh, Konstantin, this is beautiful, but you've got to take it out. It's too melodramatic." And then a few weeks ago, I put it back in because I was right. Our civilization needs to grow up. It needs to remember what makes us who we are. Yes, tolerance and freedom and all of these things are part of our history, but with that comes a responsibility to protect those things. We have to protect our freedoms, the freedom to speak your mind freely. That is what makes our civilization great. If you look at where are the greatest inventions in the world coming from, well, even though people in Russia are very smart, very, very smart, extremely well educated, historically speaking, they have to go to America or to Britain to come up with big technological breakthroughs. Why? Because these are the places where you are actually free to pursue things, to be rewarded for the things that you do. So that's what the book is about. It's reminding people the value of who we are and what we have here in the West, why people like me come from other places and want to be here, why this country, the United States, and the West more generally in our values are better than values in other places, are better than those. And I don't think we should be ashamed to say this.
No, I mean...
And Ukrainians, Peter, and this is a really important point, just to finish very briefly, Ukrainians are giving their lives at this very moment for one reason and one reason only. They're being punished for wanting to move in a westward direction. That's why. They want to be as free and as prosperous as we are, and they've been wanting to do that from the moment the Soviet Union collapsed. My grandfather, in 1991 in Ukraine, a Russian speaker all his life. You know what the first thing that happened when the Soviet Union collapsed? Started learning Ukrainian. My aunt, Russian speaker all her life, speaks, she'll forgive me for saying this, terrible Ukrainian to this day, but she speaks it because she wants her country to move in a different direction. In the first few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when double glazing became a thing in Ukraine for the first time, you know what they called it? What? Euro windows. Because everything European was seen as being this opportunity to make your life better. This is what people want, and they're now suffering and dying to protect that desire. And if they're going to do that, I think it behooves us to do everything we can to at least, if we're not going to help them as much as we can, at least we should remember what we have here and value it and treasure it.
Well, I mean, this whole thing, the NCF is based on wanting to value Western civilization. I couldn't sympathize more. I have to say, you say Western civilization could be in danger. In my worst times, I can't help thinking we've gone on a bit from that, and that in fact it's sort of lost its mind. And sometimes it's hard hard. You know, when people say the world's going crazy, you have to say to them, you know, even on Twitter, people say, oh, what's happening? The world is going mad. You say, well, I'm afraid the world is not going mad, actually. It's the West, and particularly the Anglospheric West,
yes,
which is having this nervous breakdown. You have to remember the majority of people in the West haven't lost their minds.
No.
It's the people who are running it.
Yes.
Same old thing.
Yes, and we talked about hatred of Western elites, which is understandable, and it's pushing a lot of ordinary people to look elsewhere, let's say. But yes, I agree with you. I think, I mean, and the media has not been helpful on this either. If you look at Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, whatever the ugliness that came with both of those, and there was elements of that, I think it's true to say, those were popular revolts against Western elites that have lost their minds. And the way the media tried to paint it as something else, as you know, these racist movements or whatever, was an attempt to suppress those revolts. And the problem is that, of course, whenever you suppress people's genuine democratic expressions, the revolts only get uglier. And that's always been my concern as well. The more the Western elites who have lost their minds try to impose this craziness on the rest of us, the uglier the backlash is going to be. And that's always been my concern. I'm not concerned about a bunch of woke people with pink hair running around screaming slogans. I'm concerned about the provocation that's causing elsewhere and the reaction that could come against that, which is why I think it's up to sensible people like us to go, we don't need to go off that deep end, and we don't need to go off this deep end. We need to remember who we are, what our values are, and make it okay to be proud to be British again, to be proud to be American. You know, one of the things that boggles me as someone who is a casual observer of American politics is I don't remember the last time I heard someone on American TV say, this is un-American, or on British TV say, this is un-British. They used to say that. They don't anymore, and I wonder why that is.
Yeah, the saying that I just never hear now, which was just all over, kids right up to old people, was it's a free country. Do what you like, it's a free country.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds frivolous, but actually these things are emblematic.
Of course.
People don't say it.
Of course.
They just don't say it.
Of course.
I mean, it's maybe a conversation for another time, but I am horrified by the change of attitude in younger generation who don't care about free speech, are quite open about not caring in speech. They think what they consider to be hate speech or offensive speech automatically trumps free speech. And this is shown in poll after poll. There was one this week, I think. And these are all the things that we have to do. It's a huge thing. The rot is very deep, I would say.
I agree. But I am hopeful nonetheless, Peter. I am hopeful because I think, you know, we've got to remember as well that many of these young people, they've been let down by my generation, your generation, and generations before. They have been. The way they've been educated, the way they've been taught about these issues. If people our age don't care.
I love it. You say our age. I think I'm 20. I've got 20 years on you, I think.
Well, if people your age and my age don't care about freedom, don't explain to their children why freedom is valuable, don't talk about what happens in countries that are not free. If people of your age and my age don't tell young people about, yes, slavery was bad, but it was happening much worse in every other part of the world at the same time.
Yeah.
That Arab slave traders took more slaves out of Africa than Western Europeans did, and the death rate was higher, right? If we don't explain to people that, of course, we should aim to move forward as a society and treat people as well as we can and respect the rights of minorities and allow people to live their lives as they see fit without hurting other people. But at the same time, we mustn't get into this idea that we're the worst people that have ever lived. We're not. We're not the worst people that have ever lived. We are some of the freest, most prosperous people in the history of the world. This is one of the most welcoming, open, tolerant countries in the history of human beings. And if we don't teach our children that, if they're not hearing that message in their schools, in their universities, on their TV, on their radio, then how are they supposed to think that freedom is great?
Yeah.
They're 20 years old. They don't know anything. When I was 20 years old, I didn't know anything either. And if you're not hearing that message, the message I've just given you, that the Western civilization is great, when was the last time you saw someone articulating that point on national TV?
Never.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So why are we blaming a 20-year-old for that point of view? Now, I still think some of the things that they're doing, you know, hounding professors out of universities and things like that, are wrong and bad and should be opposed, and I do oppose them. But we've got to take responsibility. We've got to take responsibility. So my child is about to be born, and I'm going to make damn sure they understand, you know, they're going to be going back to Ukraine or other countries around and seeing how people live there. So they understand. They understand the difference. They understand the difference between a free society and a less free society, a prosperous society and a poor society. And I want them to see that with their own eyes. And I think if more young people in the West had that opportunity, we'd find, you know, a lot of these things evaporate. You know, a friend of mine works in a school for children with behavioral difficulties here in the UK. And she told me the story about how they went on a school trip to Africa for a month. And after this girl came back and saw how people live in Africa, all her problems disappeared overnight. A lot of the problems we face in the West are problems of our own success, Peter, and it's up to us to solve them.
Well, look, that's quite inspiring, really, Konstantin, and particularly what you said about your child. Thank you very, very much. The book, as I said, is out in July. You can order it. An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Thank you very much, Konstantin. I'm sure we'll be seeing you on this or that with the other channel very soon. But thank you once again. That's it for this week on So What You're Saying Is. We shall see you next time. Thank you very much. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.